You're listening to The Bible Guys, a podcast where a couple of friends talk about the Bible in fun and practical ways.
Hey everybody, we're super excited to be here.
Yeah.
This is Jeff, I'm Chris, we're the Bible Guys, and we have an exciting episode here for you today.
Absolutely. Jesus is going to feed the 5,000 4 times.
Well, he already did it.
Well, he already did it, but we're going to read it 4 times.
Yes.
So it's going to be great.
Yeah, wow, that's a lot. And by the way, we're only reading it 4 times because we're still in our series where we're walking through the harmony of the Gospels, where all 4 Gospels, in this case, all 4 of them tell the same story. We're looking at the variances and the similarities.
This is one of the rare stories that comes up 4 times in the Gospel.
Yeah, it's pretty. That is rare.
It's kind of cool. Well, hey, first though, we have some really amazing mailbags.
Yeah. Mailbags.
And then when we get the high note, I can't even get up there today.
Mailbags.
There you go. So this is from Michelle R.
Yeah.
And she has a great statement. She says, "I'm so glad I find this podcast. Listening to you two is the best way to start off my day."
Aw.
I know, isn't that nice? And then she said, "You're both big family guys, so what makes you proud of your family?"
Oh, it's a
nice
compliment
one?
with a question.
I know.
That's very nice.
Isn't that great?
What makes you proud of your family?
Yes. Who says I'm proud of my family?
Whoever said that? That's a big assumption, Michelle R.
Exactly. Just kind of filling in the blanks there, aren't you?
Well, gosh, I mean, how do you answer that?
Yeah.
Because there's a billion things you're proud of. But I think I would honestly say, I mean, what else trumps the faith part, right? Mm-hmm. So
yeah.
I would say the thing I'm most proud of is I heard horror stories about PKs.
Oh, yeah.
Which is Pastor's Kids, right?
Yes.
Horror stories. And I figured out, and it's not too hard to figure out, that it usually finds its roots in kids being forced to go to church or forced to behave a certain way or told that everybody's looking at them, right? And so usually those sort of things end up with not a good outcome. So what I did, and my wife did, is we never forced them. So if they just said, they're like, "Hey, I'm sleeping in today," we would say, "Oh, that's disappointing." We would let them sleep in. So we never once forced anything, ever. And so, but we always talked about it. We always made efforts toward it. We always encouraged, but we let them become their own people. And I think it worked. So all 3 of our kids embrace their faith and they choose to come to church and they want to come to church. And all of them are in the season where people normally don't go to church.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I think that's what makes me most proud.
Yeah. So I think different kids respond different ways. There are some kids who have a totally high threshold with parents being disappointed with them.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Right.
So I think you have to know your kid well.
Yes. I agree with that for sure.
Because that phrase for most kids is enough to go, "Oh, I don't want to disappoint my parents."
Right.
But there is that occasional kid. I had one that they go, "Okay, while you're eating my food and living in my house, we go to church on Sundays." So that's the expectation. We didn't fight about it, just made it really clear. But yeah, same thing for me. I think my sons are grown up and married and they're building families and so that whole thing, super proud of the fact that they're productive citizens on the planet and trying to follow Jesus and all those things. And then my daughter Jenna, she's not married, she's still at home and just a delight, really sweet person, big heart, loves children. And all those things. So yeah, I think I feel very similar to how you feel about it.
That's awesome.
It's a little presumptuous
Well,
of Michelle to think
R.
that we're proud of our families. But
Thank you, Michelle. That's very cool.
Yeah. And my grandson is the cutest grandkid in the world, so there's that too. I can show you pictures if you want.
Is he though?
He really is.
In the world?
On the planet.
That's just silly because
he's the smartest.
Do you know everybody in the world?
I don't need to. I met the cutest.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't need to.
Yeah.
That's pretty funny.
I met the cutest one, so yeah, he's great.
All right. Well, thank you, Michelle R., for that segment. And by the way, if you want to write in, we would love to feature your comment, question, whatever it is. And you can just email us at info@thebibleguys.com, and we would love to consider that.
Yeah, that was a neat one.
Yeah. So we are going to move into Matthew chapter 14 and Mark chapter 6, Luke 9 and John chapter 6.
Yeah, and this is one of those cool stories. There's a few variances among it. So really, when you're reading in parallel like this, you want to kind of figure out where are the differences.
Right.
And the differences kind of make the story come alive.
Well, everybody...
Because this is four witnesses telling the same story.
Yeah, so buckle up. This is probably going to be like 6 minutes of reading.
Yeah, here we go. Ready? And unfortunately, I mean, it's a Bible Guys thing, and you're going to have to listen to the Bible for a minute or two. So sorry about that.
or 6 or 7.
It's okay.
Yeah.
These people need more Bible. Come on, Chris.
Yeah.
Here we go. Ready?
As if we don't.
Matthew 14, verse 13 says, as soon as Jesus heard the news, he left in a boat to a remote area to be alone. But the crowds heard where he was headed and followed on foot from many towns. Jesus saw the huge crowd as he stepped from the boat, and he had compassion on them and healed their sick. That evening, the disciples came to him and said, there's a remote place and it's already getting late. Send the crowds away so they can go to the villages and buy food for themselves. But Jesus said, that isn't necessary. You feed them. But we only have 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, they answered. Bring them here, he said, and then he told the people to sit down in the grass. And Jesus took the 5 loaves and 2 fish, looked up toward heaven and blessed them. Then breaking the loaves into pieces, he gave the bread to the disciples, who distributed it to the people. They all ate as much as they wanted, and afterward the disciples picked up 12 baskets of leftovers. About 5,000 men were fed that day, in addition to all the women and children. Mark chapter 6 tells the same story, and it says, the apostles returned to Jesus from their ministry tour and told him all that they had done and taught. And then Jesus said, let's go off by ourselves to a quiet place and rest a while. He said this because there were so many people coming and going that Jesus and his apostles didn't even have time to eat. So they left by boat for a quiet place where they could be alone. But many of the people recognized them and saw them leaving, and people from many towns ran ahead along the shore and got there ahead of them. Jesus saw the huge crowd as he stepped from the boat, and he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd, so he began teaching them many things. Late in the afternoon, his disciples came to him and said, this is a remote place, and it's already getting late. Send the crowds away so they can go to the nearby farms and villages and buy something to eat. But Jesus said, you feed them. With what? They asked. We'd have to work for months to earn enough money to buy food for all these people. Well, how much bread do you have? He asked. Go and find out. They came back and reported, we have 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. Then Jesus told the disciples to have the people sit down in groups on the green grass, and so they sat down in groups of 50 or 100. And Jesus took the 5 loaves and 2 fish, looked up toward heaven and blessed them. Then, breaking the loaves into pieces, he kept giving the bread to the disciples so they could distribute it to the people. He also divided the fish for everyone to share. They all ate as much as they wanted, and afterward the disciples picked up 12 baskets of leftover bread and fish. A total of 5,000 men and their families were fed from those loaves. Luke tells us in chapter 9 this way. He says the same story. When the apostles returned, they told Jesus everything they had done. Then he slipped away quietly with them toward the town of Bethsaida. But the crowds found out where they were going, and they followed him. And he welcomed them and taught them about the kingdom of God, and he healed those who were sick. Late in the afternoon, the 12 disciples came to him and said, send the crowds away to the nearby villages and farms so they can find food and lodging for the night. There's nothing to eat here in this remote place. But Jesus said, you feed them. But we only have 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, they answered. Are you expecting us to go and buy enough food for this whole crowd? For there were about 5,000 men there. Jesus replied, tell them to sit down in groups of about 50 each. And so the people all sat down, and Jesus took the 5 loaves and 2 fish, looked up toward heaven, and blessed them. Then breaking the loaves into pieces, he kept giving the bread and fish to the disciples so they could distribute it to the people. They all ate as much as they wanted, and afterward the disciples picked up 12 baskets of leftovers. And then John pipes up, and he tells the same story.
Yes, he does.
In chapter 6. It says, after this, Jesus crossed over to the far side of the Sea of Galilee, also known as the Sea of Tiberias. A huge crowd kept following him wherever he went because they saw his miraculous signs as he healed the sick. Then Jesus climbed a hill and sat down with his disciples around him. It was nearly time for the Jewish Passover celebration. Jesus soon saw a huge crowd of people coming to look for him. Turning to Philip, he asked, where can we buy bread to feed all these people? He was testing Philip, for he already knew what he was going to do. Philip replied, even if we worked for months, we wouldn't have enough money to feed them. Then Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up. There's a young boy here with 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what good is that with this huge crowd? Tell everyone to sit down, Jesus said. So they all sat down on the grassy slopes. The men alone numbered about 5,000. Then Jesus took the loaves, gave thanks to God, and distributed them to the people. And afterward, he did the same with the fish, and they all ate as much as they wanted. After everyone was full, Jesus told his disciples, now gather the leftovers so that nothing is wasted. So they picked up the pieces and filled 12 baskets with scraps left by the people who'd eaten from the 5 barley loaves. When the disciples saw him do this miraculous sign, they exclaimed, "Surely he is the prophet we've been expecting." And when Jesus saw that they were ready to force him to be their king, he slipped away into the hills by himself. So John tells it a little different than the other three.
Yeah.
But it's really cool.
Yeah, so there's a note, since we're going to be talking about John already. I love the fact that this note in the Life Application Study Bible says, if anyone knew where to get food, it would have been Philip, because he was from Bethsaida, a town about 9 miles away. It tells us that in John 1. And it says, Jesus was testing Philip to strengthen his own faith. And by asking for a human solution, knowing that there was none, Jesus highlighted the more powerful and miraculous act that he was about to perform. So Philip started assessing the probable cost. Jesus wanted to teach him that financial resources are not the most important ones. And we can't limit God. And I love the fact that John includes the fact that it was Philip. Right? Mm-hmm. And it makes way more sense. And then, think about it. Jesus could have easily just said, hey, go gather up bread. But he said, what do you think we ought to do? What do you think? And then he literally forced Philip to calculate the odds. And Philip's like, okay, I've done the math. And what I figured out is it would take us months. In fact, 7.5 months each, right? Or whatever it's going to be, right? To feed 5,000 people plus women and children.
Right.
So, and by the way, plus women and children, they only counted the men there because they were counting the head of the household.
The head of the household, right.
Right. So it was 5,000 households. Mm-hmm. That's what that means.
Right.
And so
it could have easily been 15,000, 20,000 people.
Yes.
Easily.
Yes.
Especially back then with how big families were.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So think about that. So let's just say conservatively 15,000 people, which, by the way, it was only a man, a wife, and one child.
Right.
So it's way more than that.
Right.
But even conservatively, if it was 15,000 people, there's only 12 apostles.
Right.
And he's saying, okay, I've done the math.
Yeah.
This is how much it would take to feed everybody with one meal.
Right.
So anyway, all that to say, I think that there's like 15 sermons in here, and I think that one of them is that when you and I know the odds and we calculate the odds and we think we know best, and God promises something or nudges us to do something or asks us to do something crazy, we have a tendency to respond with, don't tell me, I've calculated the odds.
Yeah.
I know my business.
Right.
I know my finances.
Yes.
I know this situation.
And you should.
And I know my wife.
Right.
She's stubborn.
Yep.
I know my husband. He's
mine.
Stubborn.
Not mine. Hi, Bonnie.
Right? I wasn't literally talking about Liz.
Okay.
Yeah. And so it's like, I think that's one sermon for certain, which is, when we can calculate the odds, guess what? God trumps the odds every time.
Yeah. The reason why this story is told is because this is out of the ordinary.
Yeah.
So it's not that God doesn't expect you to use your best judgment all the time, right? It's not that God doesn't intend for you to make sure that you're making wise decisions. That's why the book of Proverbs exists, is to help us make wise decisions, right? But this story is unique because now he's going to say, you've calculated it all. Now let me show you what God can do. Right? And so it's a supernatural moment. But so us being faithful, part of being faithful stewards of what God's given us is making wise decisions based on the information we have.
Right.
And what he was trying to do is, this is a lesson for Philip to go, yeah, I've got way more for you than just managing, a pocketbook and trying to plan how do you take care of a few thousand people. Now I want to show you what God can do when God steps in and adds his super to your natural.
Yeah.
Because that's what happens here. They're natural. So there seems to be a dialogue going on. Only John really dials into Philip.
Right.
The other three are saying, Jesus says, hey, go feed them. The disciples came and say, hey, you need to send them away. There's no drive-thrus open. You preach too long. The drive-thrus are all closed. There's nowhere to get any food. You need to send them back so they can find someplace to stay. And Jesus said, well, you feed them. But then John says, actually, it was Philip, where Jesus said, well, what would it take to feed them? And Philip's like, months. So then...
By the way, a drive-thru in the first century would be more equivalent to like somebody riding by a tree with a donkey, and then somebody sitting up in the tree who throws down a coconut
there you
or
go.
a banana and says, there you go.
Yeah.
That's their drive-thru.
So have you been, in the Middle East, you've been in the Middle East. Have you ever eaten any street food in the Middle East? There's usually little stalls, and they've got like little barbecues going. They got meat on sticks.
No, we were told to only trust the restaurants that we went to.
Trust me. Travel with me. I've never gotten sick eating street food.
Yeah.
But
the one that just cooked.
Yeah. You got to get the right stuff. But that's kind of common, where they would have food already cooking,
Yeah.
And little places. But they said it's late in the day, which means all the places are closed.
Right.
So there's probably no street food available. Now, you talked so long. Anybody ever get frustrated with you preaching too long?
I don't probably in my early days.
I'm sure you went long this past weekend.
Hey, that's a different story. I only had 25 minutes to preach. Then I had to include other things.
So Jesus is healing and teaching, and it gets late. Everything's closed up.
Yeah.
So the natural, Philip wasn't wrong, right? So I've heard preachers kind of get grumpy about or go after the disciples. They don't have any faith. And I don't think Jesus is correcting them for having no faith. I think Jesus is trying to expand their faith. So in the natural, they had all the right answers. Mm-hmm. And then Jesus came in and added his super to their natural.
Yeah.
And that's when miracles happen, right?
Yeah.
And so they did know they had 5 loaves. They did know they had 2 fish. Right. And they did know if we have to raise the money for this, it's going to take us months.
Right.
So they did everything they could do. It wasn't that they were just standing with their hands in their pockets and they had no solutions. It was that the solutions they had wasn't sufficient. Right. And that's when Jesus stepped in and said, hey, I'm going to do something. He added his super to their natural.
So another sermon in here is, did you notice that in all 4 Gospels, it's very interesting. In fact, I think I probably just noted this. I'm not sure I've ever thought about this before. But all 4 Gospels goes out of its way to record the fact that Jesus had compassion.
Yeah.
So think about this.
He's exhausted.
Jesus is exhausted.
Yeah.
And he probably could have told them, everybody go their own way and go find your own food, because that was a legitimate suggestion.
Yeah.
Right? Hey, have them all go back to their towns, back to their villages, and have them go hunt or whatever they're going to do, and have them go, every person and every family go eat. That's a legitimate option here. It's a viable option. But then it says in all 4 Gospels, all 4 accounts, Jesus had compassion on them. So you and I can't fathom the idea that God doesn't need food.
Right.
And we're assuming he doesn't, right?
Right.
The human part of him needs food.
Yeah, Jesus on earth needed food.
Yes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So, but the idea that Jesus was compassionate because they were hungry. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure along with that.
And they were sick.
Yeah.
And they were like sheep without a shepherd.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, that's right. Sheep without a shepherd too, right? And so that's another sermon. And then here's another sermon. And that is, God can take what little you have and make it into great things. Yeah. Which you kind of already said by saying natural and make it supernatural.
Yeah, yeah.
But sometimes what we bring to God for a task is insufficient. But God can do a lot with it. So the application of that is, if God's asking you to do something, you'd say, well, I'm not talented enough. Mm-hmm. I'm not good enough. What difference can I make?
Yeah.
Do you really want me to, do this when it's just only affecting 1 or 2? And yet the ripple effect of eternity reverberates beyond our ability to perceive.
Yeah.
And we have no idea how it'll continue to, just go on. And sometimes even way beyond our lifetime. Yeah. Because, this person gets a seed planted. It reminds me of that pastor friend of mine who's in Youngstown, Ohio, who ended up becoming a Christian way after high school. Then he became a pastor, and then I contacted him. I'm like, hey, dude, who would have ever imagined you're a pastor? Yeah. And he said, you were one of the people that made me consider it the most. Yeah. Because we were in choir together.
All right.
And he was always cutting up, and I was too. But he, in as much as they made fun of me for being the preacher guy or this Christian guy, apparently I was making a difference. And so who knows? His whole family legacy changes. The ripple effect continues on because that's what Jesus does, doesn't he?
Yep. He takes the little and blesses it and turns it into much.
Yeah.
There's one last thing. I shared this with the staff, with our church staff a while back. I think you've had a pretty rough schedule here the last few weeks.
Yeah.
Right? You're just kind of dragging. I've had a really rough schedule the last several weeks. I'm just, I feel like almost a ghost of myself sometimes over the last, especially when I get home at night.
Yeah,
lately,
for sure.
Just wiped out. And I look at this passage, and if you remember, just a couple days ago in the podcast, but this is all in the same week for Jesus, his cousin is killed. Mm-hmm. Then this says here that the disciples just came back celebrating all the great miracles that had happened, right? That they'd gone out sharing the gospel, preaching all those miracles. Before his cousin gets killed, John the Baptist gets assassinated, he's exhausted from the people all wanting to touch him and be healed by him, right? So it's just nonstop ministry, nonstop ministry, nonstop ministry. He gets the devastating news that his cousin is assassinated. Then the disciples come back and, woohoo, Jesus, this is amazing. They're all wanting to party, and he's wiped out. Then he goes, let's just get in the boat and get away. Let's go take some time together. You guys are a whole lot right now. And the people are so enthusiastic. They run ahead of the boat. They beat Jesus to the next place they're going. And he gets off the boat totally wiped out. And then the Bible says they're like sheep without a shepherd. He has compassion. He begins to heal them and teach them late into the evening. He just had a little more to give. And so he does.
Yeah.
And then one of the greatest miracles comes out of that. Right, is out of his exhaustion, out of his tired experience, out of the fact that the disciples had no more to give. They gave everything they had. They had the sack lunch, and Jesus did a great miracle. And I think sometimes, not that we shouldn't take a break, but there are times when we just lean into a ministry opportunity, and God shows up and does. This is one of the greatest miracles in the Bible.
Oh, for sure.
Right, and Jesus does it there. Now there is a time they do get away and they do go take a break. Right. But Jesus walking on the water next. But
to your point about that, about him being exhausted, is that notice that even though this was an interruption that Jesus wasn't probably in the mood for, certainly nothing he planned for.
Sure.
Certainly nothing he was,
He was trying to get away from. He was trying to get and go the other side.
Yeah, you're right. I'm trying to be kind.
Yeah, he was trying to get away from it.
He legitimately was trying to leave the crowd.
Yeah.
So how does that translate for us? Here's how it does for me in my mind, and that is sometimes the greatest opportunities to be a blessing to somebody is actually pretty inconvenient for us.
Yeah.
Because what happens is, we're on our way, we've got our own calendar, we've got our own agenda, and all of a sudden the phone rings.
Yeah.
And it's like, I'm going to take 10 minutes to talk to this person, that kind of thing. And I think sometimes what happens is we don't recognize, like, hey, these are the moments. And in our mind, we're tempted to say, I sure wish this really good opportunity would come back at a convenient moment.
Yeah.
But sometimes it doesn't work that way.
So Jesus is exhausted, and Philip says, I don't have what it takes.
Right.
And that's that moment when you have to ask God to do something special. God, I'm going to give you what I've got.
Yeah.
I don't have much to give right now.
That's
and
great.
Jesus does an amazing miracle.
Well, looks like it's about our time. So that's a good place to end. And we will see you next time, hopefully on the Bible Guys.